Okay. Hey, everybody. So we just made a slight modification to the animation that is triggered when we add an item to the list. And now we want to set things up so we can respond to the edit button. And the edit button is basically going to put our table view in an editing state, which will give us the opportunity to remove items from the list. The difference, there's a slight difference between the way that we approach, how we added an item and how we delete an item. We added an item using essentially a manual approach, right? We're adding our own button. We're setting up our own function, did-tap add, that gets called, and we're responding to that in a very custom way. We choose to present this particular view controller that we create, and then we delegate back from that view controller here to tell us what happens when we actually finish with that view controller. Editing is a little bit different, and you've already seen that a little bit from the way that we define the edit button itself. We called a function that exists on the UI view controller class called edit button item to even get this button in the first place. You'll notice that we don't need to go through the work of defining our own button from scratch. And that's because editing is a state that can affect lots of different types of UI components. It's a common trait or state that some UI components can enter into. And so there are certain things with respect to editing UI and the response to being in an editable state that come out of the box with the view controller. So I encourage you guys to read up on UI view controller, editing in particular, and table view editing. And you can do that, as always, by hitting Option or holding down Option clicking any of these method or class names, and looking at the class reference as well. We know that when we set up this edit button, when a user taps on edit, let's actually show this guy. When a user taps on edit, we have set our class up to print the word edit to the console. And we're doing this, again, not by creating our own function, did tap edit, but we're overriding the existing function that is called in response to tapping that edit button or entering the editable state. We're overriding that and going to use that as a space to implement our own custom logic. How do we respond to that? And right now we're just printing the word edit, but I'm going to get rid of that and replace that with some logic that actually reflects the use case that we're going for. So the first thing that we need to do here is call super set editing. And this is basically because I'm overriding a function set editing that is defined in the superclass. If I don't call the superclass's implementation of that function, I might miss out on certain fundamental setup logic that's happening in that superclass's implementation. You can read the documents to see what might be happening, but if you aren't sure that you want to completely override, in other words, negate any logic that's being performed in the superclass's implementation, it's for any method really, it's always a good idea to call the superclass's implementation, even if it ends up doing nothing. No harm done by calling this. So the other thing that we want to do here is put the table view into an editing state. And we can do that just by saying self.tableview.editing is equal to editing. And this is basically saying this function that we're overriding here, it takes two methods. One is a Boolean saying whether we're in the editing state or not. It's going to be true or false. So when I hit this button, the edit button, it's going to keep calling this and passing in a certain flag. We can pass this directly to the table view's editing state. In other words, we're telling the table view to enter or leave the editing state just by passing this Boolean, which we know will be true or false based on what we get here. So that's the first order of business here. We also want to say, let's see. We also want to disable the edit button because when we enter the editing state, I'm sorry, we want to disable the add button. My fault. Because when we enter the edit state, we want to enforce the fact that the user should specifically leave the editing state before they do something like choose to add a new row. Otherwise, it gets confusing, as you can imagine. And we're going to say, come on. So we're basically going to say the right bar button, in other words, the add button, is enabled when we're not editing. Okay, we don't want to enable it when we are editing. We want to enable it when we're not editing, which ensures that the user can only interact with it when we're not in an editing mode. So let's stop and run and see where that gets us. So we're seeing some nice things take effect here. One of them is when we hit the edit button, and you'll look, if you look up here, if you option click on edit button, I believe it will tell us that this will happen here. So if one of the custom views of the navigation item property is set to the returned object, in other words, the edit button, the associated navigation bar displays an edit button if editing is false and a done button if editing is true. And the default button action invokes this set editing animated method that we're overriding. So this is great. And basically, this is an effect of having called super. If we don't call super, or really if we don't do any of this stuff here, nothing is going to happen. We're going to see, as we did before, that we can hit the edit button as many times as we want. Nothing happens. It doesn't change to a done button. We know this method is being called. And that's a side effect of not calling super. If we call super, we're passing this behavior up the chain and giving the superclass an opportunity to implement or institute the behavior that it does by default, which is when this button is touched, if we're entering the editing state, the button changes to a done. If we're leaving the editing state, the button changes back to edit. So this is a great thing. Now let's see what happens if we go a step further and add an item to the list and then come back and hit editing. So we're going to add, we're going to hit done. We'll see it dismissed. We'll see the item added. We'll hit edit. And we'll see that this UI changes. And this is stock UI table view interface here for when you enter the editing state. And that basically gives you an opportunity to say, yes, I do want to delete this item, and then hit the delete button. We need to go a step further in order to make this deletion actually happen. But as you can see from the couple lines of code that we've written here, we're able to actually manipulate this edit button. When we tap the edit button, our add button is indeed disabled, which is great. And it gives us an opportunity to interact with the deletion UI that comes out of the box with a table view. So what we're going to do next is actually take that a step further and figure out, what do we need to do in order to respond to the fact that a user taps this delete button here. Cool. So with that, we'll move on to the next video.